Hello, this is the 6.14 video, War and Disaster. While the fight against al-Qaeda and the search for Osama bin Laden continued in Afghanistan, President Bush worried about attacks from other terrorists. There was no solid evidence that Iraq's Saddam Hussein had any link to al-Qaeda, but intelligence reports indicated that Iraq could be the next source of danger, and the Bush administration turned its attention there. The war that followed was controversial and far more difficult than the administration had predicted. It went on through Bush's second term and beyond. At home, the nation faced the greatest national disaster in its history. How would the government respond? Goals for this lesson: recognize the arguments for and against the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, identify the reasons for and increased opposition to the war and the conduct of the war in Iraq, describe the impact of Hurricane Katrina and the federal government's response. Don't forget to go to lesson resources and grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key. And let's continue. Reading pages 954 through 961. Complete the reading guide, complete the timeline, the Iraq war activity, and the checkpoint at the end of the lesson. Okay, starting with the Iraq war. And here's a map of Iraq and showing several different things on the map. You have in gold Sunni Arabs, in pink the Shiite Arabs, in brown showing the Sunni Kurds, and in green the other ethnic groups that populate Iraq. And you'll see in the blue arrows coalition forces where they were working March through May 2003. The little fire is a battle or major airstrike, and the oil field shows where the oil fields are. Okay, let's continue with the reading. The Iraq War. Where would the next terrorist threat come from? This question worried many world leaders. President Bush, along with Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair, focused on Iraq. Heeding the advice of top-level advisors, Bush became convinced that a free, stable, and democratic Iraq was vital to American foreign policy interests. By early 2002, both the president and key administration officials began publicly linking al-Qaeda to the regime of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. Weapons of mass destruction. Reports from the CIA and other intelligence agencies appeared to indicate that Saddam Hussein had aided and harbored terrorist groups, and that he was actively seeking to acquire or manufacture weapons of mass destruction, including biological and chemical weapons. In the past, Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against the Iranians and against Kurds living in Iraq. After Iraq's defeat in the 1991 Persian Gulf War, the United Nations had forbidden Iraq to produce or possess weapons of mass destruction. But Saddam Hussein had often refused to let UN inspectors examine sites where they suspected he might be producing weapons of mass destruction. Such weapons, the Bush administration warned, could spell disastrous consequences for the United States if they fell into the wrong hands. The United Nations and the United States demanded that Saddam Hussein produce and destroy any banned weapons and allow inspectors access to all suspected weapon sites, as he was required to do so by the terms imposed on him at the end of the Gulf War. Hussein stalled and refused to comply. On one day he would announce that the UN inspectors could do their work, and on the next he would forbid them to proceed. In March 2003, after months of diplomatic efforts, the U.S. government announced that it would use force to disarm Hussein. Despite considerable unease in the world diplomatic community and growing questions at home, Congress responded to Bush's urging and passed a resolution authorizing the President to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq. Some opponents argue that the resolution was too broad and gave the president unchecked power, but vocal supporters charged the failure to support the resolution amounted to being weak on terrorism. A preemptive war. The decision to go to war against Iraq was controversial because the United States seemed to be heading toward a preemptive war, a war in which a nation strikes first to overcome a perceived threat before the threat grows worse. Some people argue that recent history justified a preemptive war. After all, they said, if Britain and France had launched a preemptive war against Hitler, they might have stopped him before he had the chance to overrun much of Europe. Others argue that modern warfare is so potentially catastrophic that no nation should initiate a preemptive war, but should only go to war in response to direct attacks of aggression. In 2003, some nations such as France and Germany argued that the United States should not attack Iraq, but should instead give diplomacy one more time. give diplomacy more time. The United Nations refused to approve an invasion of Iraq, but President Bush pushed ahead. Operation Iraqi Freedom. In the early morning hours, Iraqi time, of March 19, 2003, Baghdad awoke to the sound of air raid sirens and cruise missiles streaking across the skies. It was the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom, in which U.S. troops aimed not only to remove Saddam Hussein from power, but also to discover and destroy any WMDs, to drive terrorist groups from Iraq, and to create the conditions for the emergence of a new, democratically elected Iraqi government. While the invading force was supported by a coalition of roughly 50 countries, most contributed only a small number of troops or supplies, while the vast majority of troops and equipment came from the United States and Britain. The initial campaign proved to be both fast and successful. Outgunned and outmaneuvered, the Iraqi army and the once feared Revolutionary Guards melted into the countryside. When U.S. troops captured Baghdad, joyful Iraqi citizens assisted by American soldiers pulled down a 20-foot statue of Saddam Hussein, who had gone into hiding. Here's a picture of him pulling down the statue. On May 1, 2003, 6 weeks after the invasion began, a jubilant President Bush, dressed in a Navy flight suit, landed on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, an aircraft carrier. There, beneath a giant banner that read "Mission Accomplished," the President told the sailors gathered on deck, as well as millions of Americans watching on television, that the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies, had prevailed. Okay, let me go back here for a moment. A picture of the bombing of Baghdad and the second day of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And let's read here this excerpt before we continue on. Live from Baghdad, embedded reporters. Some embedded reporters traveled with coalition forces. They lived, ate, and slept with the troops and accompanied them on their missions. The Defense Department sanctioned this arrangement and also placed limits on what could be reported. For example, journalists were not allowed to report on classified troop movements or upcoming missions. Some worried that embedded journalists might lose their objectivity if they came to identify too closely with the soldiers, upon whom, after all, the reporters relied on for their safety. One embedded NBC reporter recalled, "The commanding officer of my battalion gave us virtually unlimited access, even on sensitive stories. He said his orders were to let us report on the good, the bad, and the ugly. I tried like heck just to tell it like it was." For millions of Americans tuned into their television sets, embedded reporters provided up-to-the-minute coverage unlike anything broadcast from previous wars. Okay, sectarian violence. For the tens of thousands of American soldiers still on the ground in Iraq, the war was far from over. Parts of Iraq, including many neighborhoods in the capital city of Baghdad, descended into sectarian violence. And sectarian, let's read the definition here, is violence between different religious or political groups. Baghdad and other cities dissolved into scenes of chaos and looting. Even as Hussein's government fell, mobs of Iraqis looted palaces, museums, and other buildings, stealing artwork and historic treasures. Deep-seated ethnic and religious rivalries, particularly between the Shiite majority and the Sunnis, who had been favored under Saddam Hussein, exploded into a fury of bombs and bullets, often with American troops caught in the middle. U.S. troops also face a new danger in the form of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, a particularly deadly new type of roadside bomb. Militant Islamists, furious at the thought of U.S. and other Western troops on Iraqi soil, mounted suicide bombings against coalition soldiers and Iraqi citizens alike. Tens of thousands of Iraqis died in the violence, and casualties among U.S. troops mounted into the thousands. Questioning the war. Shortly after the attacks on September 11, 2001, the French newspaper Le Monde had declared, "We are all Americans." But as the war in Iraq dragged on, the initial sympathy for the United States turned increasingly to criticism. Some of the international partners who had contributed to the coalition forces lost the will to continue. Some foreign leaders accused President Bush of unilateralism, going at it alone without consulting or respecting the wishes of other countries. To make matters worse, no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. It became apparent that the U.S., British, and other intelligence agencies had misjudged Saddam Hussein's possession of such weapons. The revelation tarnished the United States' reputation abroad and led to charges that the U.S. government had used insufficient and inaccurate information to justify a preemptive war. Nor was the Bush administration able to produce evidence that directly tied Saddam Hussein to Osama bin Laden. As the suicide bombings and guerrilla attacks continued, many Americans grew discouraged over the prospects of success in Iraq. People debated the best course. Some insisted that despite all the setbacks, American interests in the Middle East were so vital and so connected to national security that the United States must maintain its military commitment in Iraq. Others wondered if the country had made the right decision in going to war. Yes, the United States had removed a ruthless dictator who had butchered hundreds of thousands of his own people and had vowed to rain destruction on America. But in doing so, had the United States become bogged down in what some characterized as another Vietnam? Was the American presence in Iraq inciting even more terrorism against the West? Terrorism spreads. While the fighting continued in Iraq and Afghanistan, citizens of other nations, particularly those seen as U.S. allies, found themselves as the target of terrorist attacks as well. In March 2004, at the height of the morning rush hour, several bombs exploded on board commuter trains in Madrid, Spain, killing nearly 200 people and wounding more than 1,500. Spanish officials determined that Islamic extremists were responsible. In 2005, 4 suicide bombers set off blasts in London subway trains and on a bus, killing 52 commuters and injuring 700. Again, officials determined that militant Islamists had carried out the attack. Intelligence agencies in Western nations worked feverishly to disrupt terrorist plans. Investigators in Britain, France, and the United States and other nations managed to stop several plots, most engineered by militant Islamists. Still, as the first decade of the 21st century unfolded, millions around the world faced the grim reality that the fight against terrorism was likely to be a long and bloody struggle. The surge stabilizes Iraq. In January 2007, opposition to the war was growing as American casualties mounted in an Iraq torn by rival Sunni and Shia militias. Some military commanders in the field recommended a gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops. After months of debate among his military and civilian advisors, President Bush concluded that what was needed in Iraq was not a gradual withdrawal, but an increased American military presence. Bush hoped this surge, as it was called, might make the critical difference in the war and bring order to an increasingly chaotic land. The White House announced that it would deploy an additional 5 combat brigades, more than 20,000 troops to Iraq. These troops had 2 urgent goals: the need to regain control of troubled Anbar province, where an al-Qaeda offshoot had emerged, and the need to secure the city of Baghdad and its environs, where suicide bombings, sniper fire, and sectarian murder had become daily events. If we increase our support at this crucial moment, Bush maintained, and help the Iraqis break the current cycle of violence, we can hasten the day our troops begin coming home. At first, it was difficult to assess whether the surge was succeeding. By June 2007, total U.S. war deaths in Iraq had climbed to more than 3,500. But by the end of 2007, the effects of the surge were unmistakable. For the first time in years, hotels and clubs in Baghdad threw New Year's Eve parties, albeit cautious and well-guarded ones. In August 2008, a correspondent for the New York Times reported that violence has plummeted from its apocalyptic peaks. Iraqi leaders are asserting themselves, and the streets that once seemed dead are flourishing with life. And as the president promised, American troops began coming home. By September 2008, the additional Army and Marine forces sent as part of the surge had returned to the United States. Tours of duty for all American troops were reduced from 15 to 12 months. Further troop withdrawals were scheduled for early 2009. Some analysts argued that while the surge had achieved its tactical goal, it had suppressed much of the sectarian violence, it had not substantially altered the political situation in Iraq. Iraq's elected parliament remained a fragile, divided institution. Tensions between Sunni and Shiite, the product of centuries of animosity, remained high, as confirmed by renewed outbreaks of suicide bombings in marketplaces and other civilian areas. Nevertheless, as the war in Iraq entered what many Americans presumed and hoped to be its final phase, Iraqi security forces were taking over more responsibilities from American troops. The final chapter of American involvement in what has proven to be a long and costly war remains to be written. And we'll stop here and finish the next section in part 2 video.